Welcome to Hamartics, where we continually miss the mark, but keep trying anyway. So I'm Hamartic, and the things that you need to know about me for this particular video are that I have a bachelor's in molecular biology from a very good university, a lot of experience as a bench scientist. I used to make a lot of DNA constructs, work with viruses, so genetics and evolutionary biology are very much my wheelhouse. And I'm also a moderate Christian as well as a teacher. All right. This is some of the perspective I'm going to be using to talk about this. I've got a bunch of others. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be reviewing the book called Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World by Isabella Burton. Now, this book is really interesting, okay? I am going to push back on it fairly hard at some spots, but I don't want you to think that I'm ripping it to shreds and I'm owning it and I'm trying to destroy. No, I would recommend that you read this. I see some weaknesses, I see some flaws, some of them serious. Nonetheless, this was a very interesting book and it provided much to think about, even if my response to the phenomenon she's talking about would be very different, and my understanding would be very different. I nonetheless think it is incredibly valuable to have this discussion. All right. So first of all, who is this Isabella Burton? So to read from the dust jacket here, to give you an idea, she is a contributing editor at the American Interest, a columnist at Religion News Service, and the former staff religion reporter at Vox.com. She has written on religion and secularism for National Geographic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and more, and holds a doctorate in theology from Oxford. She is also the author of the novel Social Creature. This is important here because if you notice these particular publications, you're going to see that she has a particular political bent. And this is going to come into play as one of the weaknesses of this particular book, and you're going to see why. Nonetheless, she's obviously extremely intelligent. She does use data. She has done a lot of research. And as I said, I wholly recommend reading this book. I disagree with good chunks of it, but nonetheless, I strongly recommend you do so. All right, so let's take a look at the cover here so you know what you're looking for. You can definitely see that there's a religious theme to it, more of a wheel than a cross, but you know, you get the same radiation from the center point, etc., almost like a weird rose window. It's actually a lovely cover, lovely cover. So let's get into it. And I'm going to go chapter by chapter, talk about what she talks about, but just to note, I am not going to go through everything. I'm going to give an overview chapter by chapter. I've got PowerPoint slides up on the screen so you can follow along. I'm not going to be reading from the PowerPoints directly. I don't like death by PowerPoint. I see no reason why I should do that to you. But they're a helpful tool for organizing my thoughts and they help you follow along with me. Okay? So if you're listening on a podcast, I apologize. I'm going to have this video up on Rumble as well, so you can find it there if you want to look at the slides. Okay, so let's get to chapter 1. Who are the religiously remixed? And the religiously remixed are who we're talking about in this book, okay? And so she's got a lot of data on who they are. So she talks about them being in 3 broad categories. You've got spiritual but not religious. So their primary source of spiritual identity comes from outside their religion. This is about 18% of the United States population. And we're talking here about the United States. She's not talking about the rest of the world, okay? Then there are the faithful nuns. Believe in a higher power, but don't belong to an organized religious tradition. So this is more of a personal spiritual tradition, and it's another 18% of the US. By the way, nuns is not N-U-N-S, it's N-O-N-E-S. They don't have any organized religious tradition. And then there are the religious hybrids. They belong to a group, but they mix and match parts of it, such as being Catholic but disagreeing with hell, which a lot of Catholics do, maybe adding in some Wiccan ideas, that sort of thing. It's sort of like religious buffet style. It's hard to figure out, but there's maybe 20 to 30% of the population have this, according to her characterization and research. And she's got some interesting thoughts. Basically, that you have people who are essentially non-religious start showing up and going up to about, in recent years, 25%, at least at the time of this writing. So it is a really interesting thing because you have a lot of people doing this, and they may form a larger or smaller percent of the population as to people who are essentially atheists, but somehow still spiritual or have some kind of religion. And so this is really what she's talking about here. Now, I should also point out that she's approaching this from a sociological perspective. So this is where Durkheim's definition of religion comes in. So the idea is that this is a set of rituals and beliefs that people affirm in order to strengthen their identity as a group. They unite people in a single moral community sustained through the energy of its adherents. So this is really a bottom-up thing. You're not, organized religion is very often seen as top-down. In the case of the Catholic Church, it's definitely top-down. But this is not always true for all faiths. I mean, there's a lot of churches that are very much bottom-up, or are organized differently so that they're primarily bottom-up with some top-down hierarchy that still must listen to the will of the people, so to speak. So it really varies. But the idea is that in this case, it's got to be bottom-up, to keep the church going. So even the Catholic Church is not and cannot possibly be entirely top-down, simply because nobody would attend church. Okay? So these communities provide meaning. So a sense of why the world is the way it is. You might think of this as a mythology. You might think of this as, almost like a creation myth or a moral story that tells you what the meaning of the world is. Is the meaning of the world to be good? Is the meaning of the world to be free? Is the meaning of the world to kill all infidels? I mean, what is the meaning of the world for you, for your group? Is it to submit to Allah? Is it to, worship the great creator mother? What is it? So then there's a purpose. So the idea is that once you know the meaning, like what you as a group mean, what the world means to you, then you shape your life in accordance with that meaning, whatever it is. You either submit to Allah, if you're Muslim, you might enter into a personalized relationship with Christ. If you're some form of Christian, you might, cast magic if you're a witch, whatever it is, you're shaping your life in accordance with that meaning. All right. And then you have a community, a place where you go to be known as a member of that community and to share up that purpose with others, to support you in reaching that purpose. So in, the traditional Christian community would be a church or, a mosque or, synagogue, whatever. For other communities, you would have these things. Temples for Buddhists very often happen, whatever it is. And then you have ritual. And this is where we need to go back to Eliade. So if you haven't read Eliade, I'd recommend it. But one of the things he points out is that, and a lot of people have pointed out, is that the purpose of ritual is to reinvigorate the community and to reify it, such that you very often find yourself reenacting the creation myths in some way. So for example, the Mass for Catholics, Eucharist, communion, those are ways to reify the community because you are reenacting the Last Supper, which is the central beginning of Christianity. His charge to the apostles, all that stuff, the statements of what Christians mean, those come from the Mass. And then once a year, we reenact the whole shebang. All right. Christmas is more of a minor holiday. It's become more major, I suppose. But, the birth of Christ is more minor, but really it's Easter. And we spend, 40 days on, Christ's acts, and then his imprisonment, his unjust death, his resurrection. We really reenact that. We reenact parts of it. Some people actually stick a person up on a cross to do it. In South America, I know there's that. Other groups, for example, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were talking about descending into the underworld and coming back, and that was reenacted in some ways. A little mysterious how, but that was. and so on and so forth. So these things reify the community, and you can in fact see this in the modern social justice faith, which she talks about here, with the hands up, don't shoot, because that is essentially talking about Michael Brown and Ferguson, and that is reifying the community by talking about one of their central foundational myths. All right. I should point out that some of these are indeed myths. There is no evidence, in fact, strong evidence that Michael Brown did not say that. But the point is not whether he said it. The point is that by saying it, you reinvigorate and renew the community by reenacting that foundational myth. Make sense? Okay. So my reaction to this chapter is this is really interesting. I'm not sure the categories are quite what she says they are, and they may be shifting. But on the other hand, she did the research. I'm going to trust her numbers as far as this goes. It's very interesting research because she's definitely true, definitely right about some things. One is that evangelicals are growing, and a lot of the more moderate religions are dying out a bit, and as we're going to see in the next chapter. So let's move on to chapter. So this was chapter 1, who are the religiously remixed. Let's move to chapter 2, which is a brief history of intuitional religion in America. And the point is that, what she tries to say about this, which I think is a fair point, is religion as personal, not social, is in our nation's DNA in the concept of separation of church and state. So we had a group of essentially religiously eclectic states. So they were Catholics, Protestants, Quakers, Calvinists, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had to basically say, look, we are going to not have a state religion because we couldn't possibly agree on what it was anyway. So this is part of in our DNA, as opposed to other groups, other countries, where this is, you have a formalized state religion. And of course, this brings to mind from Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, a comment where someone is very stolidly Church of England, in that Church of England is the church that he totally avoids going to. Lutherans have the same problem if it's a state religion, but a lot of Swedes don't attend. So that's a thing to understand too. Some European countries have the same problem. So, Now, the other thing she points out, and this is absolutely true, is that there are periodic waves of revivals in response to low church attendance, essentially bringing the faith back, and it moves in cycles. So you have the first Great Awakening, and then there was a second Great Awakening, etc. I'm not sure this is really quintessentially American, though, but it is a pattern in American religion, and I think it honestly is a pattern in other religions as well. For example, Handel's Messiah the libretto was written by the librettist and given to Handel to essentially start a religious revival. That's what he wanted to do because he was worried that England was turning away from God, and he was trying to revitalize the church. And I'll tell you, Handel's Messiah did it. It was really good. I've sung it. I love it. I mean, it revolutionized the British musical landscape very, very quickly. All right. But America also had other people, like intuitional intellectuals like Emerson and Thoreau, who rejected formal institutions and wanted us all to be spiritually self-reliant, which was then also brought about and talked about in this New Thought movement, which happened in the 1800s. And this was really kind of a self-help thing. You were doing like creative visualization and positive thinking to create total self-reliance. And, you see this again in a whole bunch of self-help stuff, almost like self-hypnosis, that you visualize yourself getting to a goal. That occasionally has some use too, to be perfectly honest. But the idea was that this New Thought thing was essentially a religion that people were adopting in addition to their normal religious practices. Now, here's where I have some slight quibbles. One of the things to note is that if you look at, for example, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, which is a great book that I would also recommend that you read, he talks about religion as a binding force in civilization, to the point where the temples got built before the castles, that you did not have a civilization that was greater than a single tribe if you didn't have a religion to bind it together, because otherwise you cannot overcome tribalism. if that makes sense. So religion is the way to deal with overcoming purely family connections. All right. So in other words, if you're a pure tribalist, you will fight other tribes, you will not cooperate. And you need that to get above the basic sort of village level. All right. So it's possible that what was going on with New Thought and some of these other things is that they're using the form of religion to almost piggyback on that essential human need for religion. In other words, if religion is in our DNA, which is the suggestion that Haidt and others have brought, that essentially it's encoded into our DNA and therefore into our neurobiology, our brain is constantly using religious patterns of thought and needs them to function in the world and to cooperate and build society. That therefore some of these things might not be religions, they might be piggybacking on those mechanisms, almost like viruses piggyback on the cell. So, there's a, I guess you could say, a little quibble here. All right. But the idea is that people have always had the practice of supplementing their religious practice with other ideas that she calls religious. As I said, I think I disagree a little bit there. Some of them maybe, some of them not. Now, the other thing that's really interesting is that post-World War II was the high mark of church attendance. There was mainline Protestantism. I mean, who knows, maybe there's just no atheists in foxholes. I mean, as has been said, but effectively mainline Protestantism really took off. And so there have been these two strains kind of prying it apart since maybe the 60s. One would be New Thought, so this pluralist, Bohemia intellectual thread from like Timothy O'Leary, the counterculture from the 60s, et cetera, versus Billy Graham and evangelical Christianity, which has been pulling the other way. And these both provide countercultural narratives to mainline Protestantism and cultural resistance. Although I think the evangelicals have taken a bit of a backseat in recent years. They certainly were strong when I was growing up, and they've been weakened a bunch. Now, chapter 3, today's Great Awakening and why it's not like the others. Or in other words, she thinks that this wave is not going to crest and descend, but it's going to self-perpetuate. And here's why. So one, she thinks, you know, there's an absence of wider demographic pressure. So essentially, nobody is saying you have to go to church. Nobody is saying the only place to meet people, you know, girls your age, whatever, is in church. Nobody is just going because it's the social center of the community anymore. So you have millennials who are disillusioned with parents' faith, and they're not interested in the evangelical denomination, so they're drifting away. Okay. 2 is consumer capitalism. So the idea is that there are companies which are essentially marketing spirituality. People are seeking a spiritual solution as they drift away from organized religion, and some companies are going, hey, yeah, we can do that. And so they're marketing things, and she's going to talk about some of them in later chapters. And it's a moral marketing scheme. And to some extent, like going woke, like signaling woke ideas is part of that. That may not be as strong a pillar as she thinks. I actually disagree here, mostly because of the recent trends in woke culture. So if you look at Coca-Cola, which faced a significant backlash recently over some of its social justice training, Disney, which just had that leaked and is facing significant criticism. If you look at a lot of the sports teams, which have been doing kneeling and the Black national anthem and stuff like that, one of the things you'll notice, and also Disney, by the way, with their Marvel movies, with what they've done to Star Wars, et cetera, you'll notice that viewership has tanked in a lot of these things. And so the thought is these may not be as strong because effectively when companies step out of their lane, which is providing products, et cetera, and try to be moral, try to moralize, they may get themselves in trouble because people don't necessarily like companies preaching to them when what they want is entertainment or they want good products or whatever. And people have been turning off at, for example, and the recent one, which was Falcon and the Winter Soldier, they had a Black Lives Matter sort of little preachy moment. And just after that moment, a whole bunch of people just shut off the show and viewing tanked. And they can tell this because it's an online thing and they can track when people turn it off. And they lost a whole bunch of views right then because people don't like being preached to. So I think this is not as strong as she thinks it is. In fact, I think it's way weaker than she thinks it is. There's some small parts where she's right, I think, her talking about Soul Cycle, but we'll get there. And then 3, I think this is where the real magic is. This is the internet. So people can connect, form online communities. People who formerly thought I was the only one in the world who had this opinion, but oh my God, I looked on Reddit or Twitter and bang, I got brothers and I got sisters. I got, I don't know, queer friends, whatever it is in this case for some of their different groups. And so they can find others with their beliefs and they can join that. And as you'll see, there's a real belief in queering the family, etc. later on, which is why I mentioned it. And essentially these online communities can form around that. And so this can help self-perpetuate things, because otherwise you might have had some of these beliefs get lost in the noise, but here this sort of reinforces them and you get genuine signal here, genuine connection, and these online communities grow. Now, this may change as the internet changes, but I think she has a very definite point here, and her argument I think is very strong. So moving on to chapter 4. Chapter 4, Harry Potter and the birth of remix culture. So here we're talking about internet fan culture and the rise of Harry Potter. And what she's talking about is how the internet fan culture really began to become really strong around Harry Potter. And so her thesis here is that this internet fan culture provides a way to collectively make identity and reinforce that identity, whether it be which house are you? Are you Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw? Are you chaotic good or are you chaotic evil? Myself, I'm neutral good. Do you identify with Angel or Angelus? Do you identify with Buffy or Spike or Willow? Essentially, these provide archetypes. Heroic archetypes in some cases, villainous in other words, I guess, to identify with. And so these provide mythologies very much like the Bible, except that since most people haven't read the Bible, or at least a lot of these people haven't, these provide their hero myths, their good versus evil. And so people can even remake these myths to make them more relevant to them, like, you know, fanfic versus Harry Potter, etc. And the idea is that this can allow you to find digital tribes via internet connections. But I think one of the downsides is there's a lot of increasing polarization because of it, even in, you know, dating. For example, when during the recent election, during the primaries, Bernie bros wouldn't date anyone who supported Elizabeth Warren. And there was this huge fight in Washington over who got to date who, and nobody would date the supporters of the Orange Man. And oh my God, I mean, I can't date a Buttigieg person because I support Kamala Harris and all this stuff. That those communities can cause problems too, which she doesn't really talk about as much, but I think it's a problem that needs to be mentioned. The other thing that is a problem is, too, don't forget, you're making saints out of mortal people here with morals that might be different from yours, would be a way to say it. So, for example, when J.K. Rowling started posting on, you know, sex versus gender and whatever, and everyone went crazy, I think part of that was because she'd created the Hogwarts universe that the fans then took over and took from her. So essentially, it's sort of like Moses coming down and going, you know, yeah, I got these tablets, but yeah, I mean, really, who needs God? You know, that was how they reacted, because their saint, the founder of their religion, had just gone slap across their collective faces. They found it objectionable, shall we say. They reacted as if she were a heretic, which is a good evidence that she, you know, this is a religion founded around her, which I think she probably found very surprising. Now, at this point, the book then goes into Gamergate, which is told from one perspective, so I would not take the Gamergate perspective as gospel. I'm not an expert on Gamergate. I've read a whole bunch of different perspectives, and she provides only one, which more fits her own narrative. So I would want to do some research on that. The same thing with her discussion of the recent Ghostbusters. Again, there is some serious pushback to be had there because there's a whole bunch of other different narratives as to why it flopped. And she blames it on conservative reactionaries. I entirely disagree there. I think part of the problem So the Gamergate, from what I understand it, was there was some issues about corruption within the reporting industry. So in other words, the people who were reporting on games, whether they were good or not, were being co-opted by the gaming industry, and so we're not providing accurate reporting, was effectively what a lot of people felt. And then there was this whole drama over it and all this fight. And so that's one narrative of it. For the Ghostbusters, a lot of people simply say, well, it wasn't a very good movie, you know? So that's one of those things where she has a very specific viewpoint on this. And I'm not sure it's accurate, but I think the fact that she has this viewpoint is because she is a progressive. So again, you can take the narratives with a grain of salt. I think her underlying point is somewhat correct in that this remix culture is very strong, and it essentially exists independent of whether or not her argument on these things is a correct argument, if that makes sense. However, I would like to point out and push back here, because she talks about Harry Potter, but one of the things that has come out recently has been an extreme struggle for what some people are describing as the soul of Star Wars and all that sort of thing. And viewership of the recent Star Trek has tanked, etc. And I think a lot of it is that there are people who are attempting to make these stories fit a certain morality. In other words, when religion arises from the bottom up, from the fans, it's a good thing. But when writers start trying to force their own morality onto the story, as opposed to using some of the time-honored things that repeat, that essentially are emergent from all good stories and myths, you know, essentially, if you read The Golden Bough, if you read a bunch of these other things, you know, what's called the heroic cycle in some ways, or the heroic story arc. When people start to try to warp that for their own political agenda, you've been seeing a lot of problems with Star Wars movies flopping, with Star Trek, some of its recent shows flopping, etc. The huge struggle with and the huge backlash against firing Gina Carano. And so you've got to be careful, because I think there's two different narratives here fighting right now in the middle of this fandom thing. And one of them is the bottom-up, more fan-based thing. And one of them is a top-down attempt to impose a culture on the fans. And there's this huge struggle here. And so right now we're talking about the fan culture rising up as part of that Durkheimian religion, but there's also a different religion that's pushing top-down to try to sort of parasitize it. And there's a huge fight there. So we can talk more about that later. I'm not really a huge expert here, but you might look at Doomcock if you're interested in that, or The Quartering, or some of those. They all have different viewpoints on it, which might be interesting to you. Okay, chapter 5, wellness culture and the rebirth of new thought. So she starts with Soul Cycle, and what she's talking about here is personal improvement and commodified self-care. So this is where the companies come in, all right? And this is where I think her company argument is good here. But they have a particular narrative that works very well here, all right? And there's a bunch of other types of thing that do it, not just Soul Cycle. But the point is that this is based on a mythology of sort of the opposite of original sin, that we were all born good and pure, and then society has corrupted us. So in other words, the way we want to return to our state of grace is by listening to ourselves, listening to our intuitions, and by taking care of ourselves, living our best life, all right? And there's a lot of pseudoscience that comes out and supports this. As a scientist myself, if someone says positive energy, I look at them funny. What? Positive ions coming from candles. What? Those aren't things. Detox. Sure sign someone's trying to sell you something, all right? Cleanses, all this stuff. All these buzzwords are pseudoscience. But they're pseudoscience that really, they're pseudoscience because they're terms of belief. They're statements of faith, as opposed to actually attempting to be scientific solutions to the world. And I think that's an important thing to note here. And this is in some ways similar to the wealth gospel, or a revival of new thought. In other words, you deserve the good things, all right? It's not about you listening to God and going closer to God. It's about listening to yourself. It's about being the best you can be. It's about being wealthy, right? And so this was a Christian doctrine that basically said that, you know, being wealthy is good, and being you is good. Being selfish is kind of good, as long as you give to the church to forgive your sins, so to speak. because God rewards you with wealth, and so being wealthy is a sign that you're good. Well, in this case, this is kind of more like you are rewarded by the world by returning to that state of grace, and so listening to yourself, etc., and doing the self-care, getting away from people who are toxic, who don't support this lifestyle in you. That is essentially your way to a perfect life, a good life. And one of the things about it is that is sort of the more we cherish ourselves, the more we are capable of spreading love outwards. So we can't live for others first. We have to live for ourselves first. And then this will trickle down onto others. This is sort of like the myth of the Confucian ruler. Like the perfect ruler is just virtuous, and the virtue spreads from them. So there's a bit of a pushback here because I don't know, I'm worried because I've known a lot of people who do this, and some of them really get narcissistic. And I think part of it is because you live for yourself, and you sort of rely on your own goodness to spread to others. Well, you're not making an active effort to pay attention to them. You're paying attention to you. All right. And it's sort of like in Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the things that happens with addicts is they become supremely selfish. So what do you do about that? Right? And so if you are becoming supremely selfish, one of the cures for being addicted is to focus outwards, to start living for others more than you. And that's something Alcoholics Anonymous tries to do.